think we'll get started with question and answers. I'm not Chris Rock. This is not the Oscars, but we do have our winning performer here.
Can I just start with not really an answer, but somebody brought up Kerala. And another person brought up some of the impact of the British on India. And Kerala is one of the more interesting places in India, in the very far south. Whereas North India is a dry, treeless plain, Kerala is lush, tropical vegetation. But one of the northern part of Kerala is an ethnic group called the Nayars, which is one of the largest matriarchal societies that anthropologists have ever found. There's some small groups in remote, like in the Philippines, some other areas, but this was a very, very large group in which the women completely controlled everything. Names, actually throughout South India and into Sri Lanka, you have matrilineal inheritance. In other, young men will adopt their mother's names.
Matrilineal.
Matrilineal,
that's pretty serious.
Now, what?
I said that's pretty serious.
Now, it was also matriarchal. The women controlled all the property. Land went from mom to mom, or mom to daughter, not mom to mom. The husbands were largely left out of the picture from an economic standpoint. Another feature that really drove the British crazy, and it's part of the reason why they had to do something about it, was they had a practice that was called weekend marriages, where the wife could tell the husband to leave and bring another guy in. Victorian Britain did not go over well with that. The British, basically, it was an offense to their value system. So what did they do? They required that the census had to record, and all deeds had to record a woman's property in the name of her husband, which meant immediately the matrilineal connection was gone. And that was done throughout Sri Lanka and much of South India, because the matrilineal inheritance was much broader. But once they did that, they then required that the property be put in the name of the husband. And that pretty much took the power the women had. I mean, there's still the Nayars. You meet a Nayar woman and you can have jokes with them about whether they keep their husbands in the closet or allow them out. But they're still considered very, very much a...
Excuse me, at what time did that occur?
This was in the late 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. So, I mean...
Sorry, can I ask you to use your phone?
I have it hidden. I'm sorry. Yeah. There we go. Hello? All right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, this was, I mean, the Nayars persisted up until the British were able to get rid of them. It's sort of the side of the British that they sort of did a lot of things in India that often they didn't really see the ramifications or the importance of it. All right, questions?
It's my understanding that a lot of the educated people come from Tamil. A lot of the educated people come from Tamil Nadu. Most of the IT guys come from
Karnataka. Syria.
Yeah.
Right here, Bangalore.
Yeah. Is that a problem with the perception of India as being a Hindu state?
It's not. This is a longer question or answer.
Okay.
The Modi movement is a North Indian. This is the Hindi-speaking areas of India, and the Modi movement is very closely allied with the speakers of Hindi. It is not popular in the South. So, from that standpoint, the South is sort of being left behind, but a lot of them don't care. There's better education in the South. The state of Kerala that I just talked about, where the Nayars were, has as close as you can get to universal literacy. The state of Bihar up here has maybe still 40% of the population are literate. So you're down here 96, 97% of the population, and young people are all literate. So you have a higher level of education. Although Bangalore is the Silicon Valley of India, what the Indians have done is they've created another Silicon Valley up in Hyderabad and a number of other cities. A lot of the IT people are coming from other parts of India, and they're brought in. I mean, India's educational system at the university level works very well. If you can get into the universities, you're going to succeed. But unfortunately, their admission rates are less than 1% of the people that qualify. So the result is you've got a very large population of technical people, and not just IT, but also in the sciences, in engineering. And you've got then this gap in the rural areas of all of these illiterate people. I mean, it's not unusual. I always sort of joke. I mean, this is the reality of India. For an illiterate parents whose son is able to get a scholarship to become a rocket scientist and come back home with a PhD in nuclear physics or whatever, and come back to the parents who do not speak or cannot read and write. I mean, it's not a common occurrence, but you do have that kind of a gap. So it is a huge gap. There are higher levels of education down in the south and among the Tamils in Kerala. I don't know if that got to your head.
You mentioned that...
Where's it coming from? Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I think you talked about some disillusionment with Prime Minister Modi. Am I correct that last fall in Bihar there were some elections that indicated some opposition?
There's been other local elections, and basically his party hasn't been winning them. So there is disillusion. What's interesting is India's economic growth has been going at 7 to 10% a year, okay? Which is, you know, the U.S. at good times was going at 2.2, 2.3%. So that's really good. But it's centered in Mumbai, it's centered in Bangalore, it's centered in Chennai or Madras in the south, Hyderabad. It's centered in the urban areas. The rural areas are getting left behind by it. And it's the villages that are going to decide who the next prime minister is. Now, they are the people that are most susceptible to this nationalist appeal, but they're also the people that are left out of the economic wealth of the new modern India. So it's kind of a, what's been happening is Modi has sort of been losing them. And we'll see what happens. Yeah.
You mentioned about the media's role in nationalism, and I know India has a very strong movie industry competing with Hollywood in production and sales. Are they following Modi's example?
No. And, well, the problem is, I mean, Modi knows when to push and what buttons to push. If he challenges Bollywood, he's going to go nowhere. It's going to hurt. But I'm sure that will be a target. Again, there's so much I didn't talk about. One of the other targets of these radical followers of Modi are young Indian women who are dressing inappropriately, wearing Western clothes that show the shape of their body. And what they do is they beat them up and often rape them. Bollywood, that's part of Bollywood. So it's very clear, I mean, he would probably like to touch it, but India is a country that everybody goes to the movies. And when you talk about cultural transformation, India is a country with arranged marriages in the rural areas. Bollywood sells an image of love marriages, where couples come together. And every young couple today, because of Bollywood, want to have a love marriage. Of course, mom and dad won't let them. And, I mean, this is the impact of changing culture. So, you know, basically, he hasn't touched Bollywood yet. I don't know if he can. Not for a while, at least.
You talked about the couple that might be illiterate who has the son going to university. how does that fit into that caste system that you talked about earlier? Would that family be of the lower caste, upper class, whatever?
There's actually, they have affirmative action, actually they have quotas, not affirmative action, but quotas for lower caste people in the universities. So if you've got a very bright lower caste child that is able to get admitted to the university and basically win one of these seats, it could be lower caste, it could be upper caste. India has tried to get rid of the caste system. The problem is, even in the urban areas, well, I always tell people, if you're talking to an Indian about caste, they're always sensitive about Westerners misunderstanding it. And they'll say, okay, caste isn't important. Ask them if they would let their child marry someone of a lower caste. And they'll go, oh, of course not. That's the last bastion of caste in India. They may actually allow low caste people to touch them, which is polluting and not good. That's a big improvement, but they will not let their child marry into another caste. But the caste system, the Indian government has tried to break down the economic part of the division within caste. Just as another sidelight, caste dictated not only where your status was in society, but it also dictated your job. There are separate castes for masons, for sweepers, for prostitutes. So you're born into it, that's your job. The problem is, in modern society, there's no caste for rocket scientists, or actually businessmen even. And a lot of low caste people were able to rise up economically because the upper caste wouldn't start a business. And some low caste guy figures, hey, I can start selling this stuff. I have a friend, a Sri Lankan, very low caste, whose father started selling handkerchiefs on the street. He's now worth probably almost as much, probably as Donald Trump. Sent his kids to boarding school in London. Very, very wealthy. But a lot of that was because the upper caste would not go and touch that kind of job. Somebody?
I have another question about the movie industry. I'm aware that not only is Bollywood, but there's a Tamil movie industry and a Malayalam movie industry and a Telugu industry. But my question is, how do they cross the language barrier? For example, a Bollywood movie, how does it play in North India?
Well, Bollywood is North Indian. They're the Hindi language.
Oh, they're, okay.
Now, the Tamil industry, the Telugu, that's why you have those movie industries, because the local population doesn't want to listen to a Hindi movie or read the subtitles. But basically, these are feeders. Every once in a while, you'll get a super Tamil star who makes it to Bollywood. And they have to learn Hindi, and suddenly that is where, that's, I don't know if there's an example of, basically the Omaha local theater versus going to Hollywood and getting into a movie. It's the big time. So, but that's because of the language differences.
So, around the world, including in the West, you have lots of situations where the political elite tries to link nationalism to religion. Poland with Catholicism, and Ireland with Catholicism, and so on and so forth. Iran. What about Pakistan? Where does Pakistan fit in? And could you briefly compare religious nationalism in Pakistan with Modi and Hindu Indian nationalism?
Yeah. Pakistan, first of all, is a Muslim country. The Islam of South Asia is much more moderate Islam. You don't have as much support for the Salafi or Wahhabi sect that you get over in Afghanistan or even up in the Northwest Territories. So you're dealing with more moderate Muslims. Pakistan has battled over this idea of secularism versus religion. And what has happened, basically the political history of Pakistan is you have a military government, it decides to hold fair elections, you get an elected government, twice Benazir Bhutto, and then you overthrow her with the military after 2 years. What happens with the military is is they have traditionally been secular. So they rein in the religious parties. You have religious parties that are very powerful, but they're moderate parties, because if they go too far, they're likely to bring on the military to pull them out of power. So it's a different situation. Part of it's because Pakistan has such an important role for the military, and the military intersperse themselves into the politics.
In that balance in Pakistan between the secular and the religious, it strikes me it's rather similar to Turkey, in the history of Turkey with the military. But in Turkey, the balance has shifted more and more under Erdogan toward a religious nationalism. Is there any sort of trend or shift in Pakistan in favor of the secularists as opposed to the religious parties, or is it still evenly balanced?
No, the religious parties are more dominant. But they have this fear that the military, if they push too hard. There's also one other dimension, and this is the scare. This is what political scientists think about. We're getting into a conversation. The scary part of this, there is the, more or less what you would call the ISI, which is the CIA of Pakistan. They are the people that were involved in making contact and supporting the Taliban or the radical Muslims that were fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. They are riddled with radical Islamic beliefs. So you have this one wing of the military that are very, very, I mean, probably on a par with I don't want to put them in the class with ISIS, but they're pretty radical and very much supportive of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, they're kept out of the power structure of the military by the civilian leaders. So the generals who are not part of the CIA get to be in the top, and they tend to be secular. But the ISI is potentially a real danger and threat because they have power. And they're much more of a military operation than, say, the CIA is. So it's more threatening than Turkey. But as long as the military maintain that secular role, they sort of keep them in line.
Question here. I'll backtrack a little bit. I think I heard you say that in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese also have a caste system?
Yes. I didn't say that. I don't remember saying it. If I did, I was right. Yeah. What's interesting is the Sinhalese caste is much weaker than the Indian caste. In India, the Brahmins are at the top. They're maybe less than 1% of the population. In Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese caste, the Goyagama, are more than half the population, which changes the dynamics. But you have, I did talk about caste, I remember, but you have a lower caste within Sri Lanka that are treated the same way the castes are in India.
Can you on the culture and the religious movement of the Sikhs in India and how they're affected by all this nationalism?
Sikhs, does everybody understand a little bit about the Sikh religion? Just a quick introduction. After Islam came to India, there was a movement, this is so typical Hindus, there was a movement to merge Hinduism and Islam together, and that's the Sikh religion, which is mostly Hindu. It's seen as heretical to the Muslims. The heartland of the Sikhs is up here on the Pakistan border, northeast or west of Delhi, in the capital city of Amritsar, which is right on about 10 miles from the Pakistan border. They have their own state. It has been for 40 years the wealthiest state in India. The Sikhs are really hard workers. They bought into the Green Revolution. Economically, they've done extremely well. What has happened, of course, is they had a revolt against the government that was taken down in the 1980s. The Indian military went into the Golden Temple of the Sikhs and murdered or shot and killed a large number of people, put the movement down. And since then, most of the Sikhs are into making money now. And they're kind of left out of this picture. Modi has left them alone. I mean, this guy is not foolish. And the dominant Sikh party has sort of supported it. And so Modi has left them alone, and they're allowed to run their own state. And the Sikhs outside, I mean, almost all the taxi drivers in Delhi are Sikh. You know, they're doing okay. And they're sort of tolerated. So the Sikhs are kind of left out of the picture. And they're not really affected by this yet. But they could be. I mean, it clearly... part of the Sikh religion was they were horribly persecuted by especially the Muslims. And so they have this great sense of martyrdom. And they fear being taken over.
Bob, just listening, I had a question, but listening to what you just said, it made me reflect on the Sikhs and the parallel to the Yazidi population who really didn't have particular problems with Saddam Hussein because he left them alone and simply was persecuting the Shia Muslims and annihilating the Marsh Muslims in the south. And then, of course, after his disposition, we know what happened to them. And so I'm sitting here reflecting, thinking if Modi's policies move forward, what's the eventual outcome for the Sikhs? But it tied into my original question, which was, in the south, the Muslims were part of that old Muslim empire, really. I mean, that was the heritage. But in the north, in Kashmir, that has been the flashpoint for India and Pakistan. So can you contrast for me a bit how you think Modi's movement, policies, direction are going to affect differentially these two areas? I mean, if it really is a eugenics process, if it really is a selective depopulation.
But there's for starters, the Sikhs are different than the Yazidis in that there's about 35 million of them. And they're wealthy. And they own a lot of property in Delhi and Mumbai. So they're an economic elite. Now you brought up Kashmir, which is at the core of the dispute between Pakistan and India. Modi has made it very plain that Kashmir will never leave India. And it's not even negotiable. There's been violence. Kashmir has been opened up to tourists because it's fairly safe to go to. In the last year, there's been violence there carried out by Indian military. One of the things I didn't talk about, again, one of the programs of Modi is any Muslim who speaks out against the government nationalism creates. And I'm talking now about more radical expressions of nationalism. I was trying to think of I was going to use the British as an example of the more moderate nationalism, but talk to a Scotsman and not going to happen.
If I could just add a couple of points on this. You do have Irish Catholic nationalism, which many people would say has moderated over time and hasn't remained so austere as it once was on abortion, on divorce, on sex education, etc., etc., etc. I think when the Irish Republic was created in 1922, you had a very radical, severe form of Irish Catholic nationalism, which has moderated in relative terms. And the other point I would make, this is exactly the issue in Iran right now. Will the revolutionary Islamic Republic of Iran moderate over time as the U.S. and others try to bring it into the mainstream on nuclear weapons or whatever? So there is the question of what happens to religious nationalism, which starts out to be very radical and intolerant. Will it moderate over time or not? Which do, which don't, and why?
That's what political scientists do. And I mean, that's an outstanding issue point, David.
Could you talk a little bit about Bhutan? Why is the state of Nebraska getting 100 refugees a year from Bhutan?
I think because of the oven. The oven, the main chefs in the oven have always been Bhutanese. And they come, they work for 10 years, and then they go start another Indian restaurant in Lincoln. So you have, actually, I don't know if this is true, but I believe it is. I think there are more Bhutanese restaurants per capita in Lincoln than any place in the world outside of Bhutan. And a lot of it is because of they've used these Bhutanese chefs. So, I mean, you have the one down where I live down in Williamsburg that actually they have Bhutanese dishes on the menu. Most of them do the typical Indian. So I think that's part of it. But and Lincoln is also a target place for refugees. I've had a number of students that were placed in St. Louis or Chicago, and one Uzbek family that lost everything the second day they were in St. Louis. They were basically, somebody barged into their apartment at gunpoint and stole everything. And we moved them to Lincoln, where that doesn't happen. So I think that's part of it. Bhutan has a very, very intolerant government. And they don't tolerate any kind of dissent. They also have, I have a lot of connections to the Tibetan community. And the Tibetans go back and forth. Lhasa is right here north of Bhutan. So a lot of the routes across the Himalayas, they have to sneak through the mountains because you can't go through the Chinese border crossings. If they go into Bhutan, they risk the possibility of arrest. I know a number of Tibetans whose relatives have been arrested and killed in the prisons. But Bhutan has a very serious human rights issue. So that's where the Bhutanese refugees are coming from, and then Lincoln, I don't think it has to do with the restaurants, but I mean, there probably were more Bhutanese in Lincoln than any other city in the U.S. prior to this, but Lincoln is a target city for a safe place to bring refugees.
Starting about a year ago, I noticed an interesting phenomenon that is manifesting itself in India. That is the production of relatively technical equipment requiring very close machining tolerances and very careful assembly. There is two competing companies, one very well-respected Austrian company and one very respected Italian company, that are now producing units that say made in India by, and they give the name of the equipment manufacturer in India. I was surprised, given the strife that exists and the lack of ability to speak with each other and get along, that a company was able to be put together that could meet the criteria of these two companies, because they're pretty picky.
Let me just make one step back for a second. When we talk about strife, we're talking about 1.3 billion people. If you go to India, it is going to be one of the more peaceful places you're ever going to visit. It's not that there's all this violence going on. I mean, there's pockets of it. And especially in some of the rural areas, there may be some. But for the most part, it's a pretty peaceful place. The language differences, at the higher education, the technical fields, all the textbooks are in English. So if you want to be an Indian scientist, you have to learn English and study English, because the PhD classes are going to be in English. So you have a link language with English. And basically, if you're going to go from a Hindi-speaking area to work in a Tamil area, you're going to learn Tamil. Or you're not going to do it. So when you get up to that technical level, I thought you were leading into, there's a Tata Industries in India is one of the most amazing conglomerates. They're building equipment for space stations, they build cars very efficiently, they build heavy machinery, they build oil drilling equipment, and that's just the beginning. I could go for the next hour and a half. And I don't know whether, Tata is working with these foreign companies, but it's a huge conglomerate.
Where is it based?
Mumbai. I mean, they came out with a car a few years ago. It won't sell in the U.S. because it won't meet emission standards. But it's $4,300 and you get 4 people in it. And top speed, 60 miles an hour. I mean, it's for the price, it's very inexpensive.
They own the Volvo brand now too, I think.
Sherman tank.
Well, what they're doing now is they're going all over the world. I had a friend I met when I was first doing my dissertation in Sri Lanka. He never finished, but he joined the CIA. He left the CIA and wanted a job, and Tata offered him a job because he was working with oil production in Central Asia. And Tata tried to hire him, and the CIA said no. But they hire lots of foreigners. They're buying corporations. I hadn't heard about Volvo, but that wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, it's a massive conglomerate, and they're doing all kinds of stuff. So India does things well when they do them. I mean, they've captured the IT market, come on. And I love it when I get the phone calls from somebody, and occasionally they'll give me the Indian name and then they'll say they're in Chicago, and it's, yeah, right. I try to say something in Hindi to them and they'll suddenly go, oh, it's okay. But, you know, I mean, it's, you know, they learn how to speak with a US accent. And it's kind of scary how effective they are. But India does things well when they do it. It's just you've got 700 million people living in abject poverty.
Can you spool back in time a little bit and talk a bit about Sri Lanka?
I'm still looking for...
Oh, right here.
Oh, David. And I didn't recognize your voice.
Talk about Sri Lanka and how massive natural catastrophe, the tsunami, interplays with nationalism in that very conflicted place, so that we can understand a little bit about how that interaction works.
Yeah, everybody remembers the Boxing Day tsunami. Started over here in Indonesia, right down roughly off here. The wave came and hit the east coast of Sri Lanka. From roughly right about where my finger is on the border north, it's Tamil populated areas. That at that time there was a ceasefire in the Civil War. And these areas were controlled by the guerrilla group, which was on the US terrorist list, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The government never accepted the death toll from the Tamil areas. I think the official government death toll was 36,000. And most of them were in the Sinhalese areas along the south, and then when it whipped up to Colombo. And then there was an outpost in the city of Trincomalee and Batticaloa. What I was told from the LTTE was their death toll was 70,000. But the government never even acknowledged it, which is number one. The second problem you had was when the relief started coming in. The relief went largely over here, south of Colombo, where the tsunami came under and sort of whipped around, and you had a rise of 5 or 6 feet. It did a lot of damage to buildings, it didn't kill many people, but that was where most of the money went. I went and documented a lot of the places where the money went. And then the president's hometown was over here. It got a lot of money. That got hit and devastated. A year later, I went and there was a riverbed 5 miles up the river. There was still debris from the tsunami that had been driven from the city 5 miles inland. I mean, it was just massive destruction. On the east coast, it just came and went in a mile to 2 miles, destroying everything. But there was no relief. One more dimension, I still remember talking to U.S. Navy men. The U.S., right after the tsunami, sent a naval ship, medical hospital ship. Because the LTTE was on our terrorist list, if we helped anybody who lived in the areas controlled by them, they would be violating the Patriot Act and providing material support to terrorists. So, a 3-month-old baby that has something stuck in the side of their head, we could not touch them. The U.S. Navy sent the ship like a half mile from the border, and the Navy men were told adamantly, do not ask where they're from. Because if anybody were to say that, you know, I'm from 3 miles north, suddenly they become terrorists, and the Navy guy gets arrested or court-martialed. I mean, this is part of the difficulty in dealing with these things. And most of them, I mean, most of the villagers in the Tiger-controlled area were, you know, civilians that didn't really support the guerrillas or the government. And they were caught in the middle. But yeah, very clearly, there was a, definitely the Tamil ethnic areas were ignored in the rebuilding.
Can I ask about one other area that you may or may not know about, which would be the Thailand, the rural south, the old Muslim kingdom, and the Buddhist north, and that interplay with Thaksin and his legacy, where that's kind of bound up in it, and it's really a Malay Muslim population
And that's the problem.
in the south, and a Thai Hindu population or Buddhist population.
I've done a lot of work in Thailand, so I could have done a similar version with different names and places on Thailand. The Thai culture is a very exclusive culture. It's much more dominant in Thailand. The Thais have battled the Khmers in Cambodia and the Burmese for the last 500, 600, 700 years. And the sense of Thai culture is very important. Most of Thailand is made up of Thais, except when you get up into the north, you have a lot of tribal people. You also have people coming across from Burma, or tribal groups that are in Burma. The Karen, which Lincoln is a big target for, are people from this area. And then in the south, David was talking about there's an insurrection in the very far south of Thailand of Muslims who are Malays. They're not Thais. When I was doing research in Thailand a number of years ago, First Lady Hillary Clinton went to Thailand and caused an international incident. There was a young tribal woman, I think she was 15, she was a few weeks away from becoming 16. She had 2 children. She had been enlisted into prostitution at the age of 13, and she was now living with her 2 children in basically a hospice facility for people dying of AIDS. She was about to die. Hillary Clinton had done a lot on trafficking of women, and this young woman learned about Hillary and just worshipped her. Hillary made a trip. I had a friend who ran the hospice camp, and Hillary made a trip and visited her. She would die 2 days later. It's kind of sad. But the young girl couldn't stand up to meet Hillary. Hillary met her in the chair, got down on her knees, and held her hands. And immediately the press took pictures. The Thai government demanded the U.S. to have all of those pictures taken out of the newspapers and taken back, because she was touching a tribal person, which nobody bows or goes on their knees before tribals and touches them. I mean, this is the attitude. The Khmers, the Thais, the Burmese have a real sense of ethnic nationalism and the purity of their culture. These tribal groups up in the north, where are we? I just lost it. The tribal groups up in the north are stateless people. There's a whole set, the Lasu, the Hmong, we're familiar, the Hmong are more in Laos, the Karen. They're stateless people. They're not given free education in Thailand. Most of them were born there. Most of them, their parents were born there. They've been there for hundreds of years. They will never be Thai citizens. They cannot legally work, although they often get work. I took a group of students who built a water supply system to one of these tribal groups in northern Thailand, and the per capita income of the village was $60 a year, to give you an idea of the poverty, abject poverty. For 6 months of the year, the water to their well basically dried up, and the women had to go 5 miles to get the water. We built about 2 miles of pipeline that provided them with the water through the mountains. But this is the sense of Thai nationalism, and it clearly has resulted in the kinds of problems with the Malays in the south.
Does the Karen population or community in Lincoln, do they come from Thailand or do they come from Myanmar?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them are from Myanmar, or the U.S. government refuses to recognize the name. We still call it Burma. But most of them are from Burma. What you have is there were small numbers of Karen in Thailand before the Burmese started exterminating groups. I mean, the Burmese are even worse when we talk about this nationalism. But yeah, I think most of them are Burmese. They're really adept at elephant trading, which I'm not quite sure Lincoln should start an elephant trading industry. Got a couple more minutes, anybody?
To clarify, many of them, they're classified as Burmese even though they were born in the refugee camps.
They're coming from Burma.
Yeah.
I visited another refugee camp with students of the Shan group, which is about 7 million in size. It was a big kingdom in Burma. Because of the sensitivity between Thailand and Burma, Thailand does not recognize them as official refugees. So they're in an unofficial refugee camp, which means they have to have dirt floors, they cannot have cement floors, they have to have thatched roofs. They've been in that camp that we visited for 13 years. And their village had been taken over. We actually could go up to the border and look across and become an army camp. So they were never going back. But they weren't allowed to have permanent shelter. And, 13 years is a long time to be temporary.
Could you say a little bit more about Indian foreign policy under the influence of this Hindu nationalism? You mentioned Nepal. But some people think the experience of British colonialism and having sort of been dominated by outsiders is a big influence on Indian foreign policy that's separate from Hindu nationalism. Like India doesn't really want to go into Syria big time or intervene in other countries with big human rights problems, not because of Hindu nationalism, but because of being a post-colonial state. Could you comment on foreign policy?
On the surface, it looks like the Indians have this sort of a love-hate relationship with the British. And when you get into, especially the issues, the modern transformation of that, you get the real anger. There is a lot of anger about the British and what they did. You get to see it in certain circumstances. But as a result, the Indians still have this sort of love-hate relationship with Great Britain, where they will support Britain on some issues, but when it deals with British foreign policy in a place like Syria or other third world countries, they immediately back off. And it doesn't have anything to do with nationalism. I mean, your observation is 100% correct. It has to do with this very strange relationship. There's a couple of light shows at night at some of the historical monuments, and they give a history of the colonial era. It's fascinating, because it's not the history I've read. It's completely different, and it presents it in a completely different way. But there is still a lot of lingering anger towards the British, but then they still treat the Brits, put them on a pedestal at some point. But foreign policy-wise, it very clearly there is a duality there. They'll go along with certain things, but if it deals with third world, colonial, post-colonial states, you can probably see them opposing it.
We are at the appointed hour, so I hope you will join me in saying thank you.